Aerobic respiration. Let's look over here first. In aerobic respiration, step 1 is always glycolysis. And during glycolysis, you have 2 pyruvate and 2 ATP molecules that are formed. So that gives you a little bit of energy and the pyruvate to start the rest of the aerobic respiration process. So step 1, glycolysis, where you get the pyruvate and the energy that you need to keep going. So the next step is where our pyruvate is converted into 2 acetyl groups that are combined with coenzyme A to form acetyl CoA. And that's just an abbreviation letting you know it's the acetyl groups combined with coenzyme A. And we got this from pyruvate, which we got from glycolysis, where some glucose was broken down. So let's keep going. Next, the acetyl CoA enters the matrix of the mitochondria, where it enters the Krebs cycle. And this is also called the citric acid cycle. So we've got our acetyl-CoA entering the matrix of the mitochondria. This is where it's going to take place. And then it enters the Krebs cycle. During the Krebs cycle, 8 additional hydrogen-rich NADH molecules and 2 additional FADH molecules are generated during the Krebs cycle. So we've put our pyruvate, we've broken down our pyruvate into 2 acetyl groups, combined them with coenzyme A. We've turned that acetyl-CoA through the Krebs cycle into these 8 additional NADH hydrogen-rich molecules and the 2 FADH molecules. And now we're going to keep moving them. And in the next step, these are reduced. That's going to be in the electron transport chain, still in the mitochondria. So, electron transport chain, these are reduced, and the resulting electrons create a proton gradient. And these protons that have been created kind of cascade down the gradient. And as they do that, in ATP synthase, they generate 30 or more molecules of ATP. So just imagine those protons cascading down, and as they slowly fall down, they're generating energy, and it can be 30 or more molecules of ATP that are generated. So let's look at all this in a diagram, maybe simplify it a little. So we've got our cell, and nutrients are taken into that cell. In the nutrients, we're going to get some glucose. And from 1 molecule of glucose, we are going to carry out glycolysis and get 2 ATP, net energy over here, plus our pyruvate. And all of this happened in the cytoplasm of the cell. So we're inside the cell, but we're in the cytoplasm. But next, the pyruvate is going to go into the mitochondria. Singular mitochondrion. So it's just going in this one, and it's going to keep going, and the acetyl-CoA that we got from the pyruvate is going to go into the matrix of the mitochondria and enter the Krebs cycle. During the Krebs cycle, we're going to get these molecules we talked about, our hydrogen-rich NADH and our FADH, and they're going to enter the electron transport chain. And as they are reduced, they form that proton gradient. The protons cascade down and generate 30 or more ATP molecules with some waste particles in the form of H2O, water, and carbon dioxide. So there are some waste products here, but oxygen went in because this is aerobic respiration. We got 30 plus molecules of ATP plus the 2 from glycolysis, so a net of 32 total. Now that could differ because the mitochondria has this membrane around it, and some energy can escape from the membrane and some energy can escape from the cell. So sometimes you lose some of that energy along the way, but on average you could get 30 to 32 net ATP molecules from 1 molecule of glucose. And then you do have some waste products left over. This is a really complicated process. Hopefully this has simplified it for you, but the primary reason that a cell is going to undergo aerobic respiration is so that it can get a lot of energy and expel some waste products.
Equilibrium is a constant state under a given set of conditions, but it can change to a different state if the conditions change. So notice here that equilibrium can change if the conditions change. And so that's why we call this dynamic equilibrium. Equilibrium systems are dynamic in that they can respond to stresses or changes in conditions. So if the equilibrium system is stressed or the conditions change, a dynamic equilibrium can respond. Or rather, I should say, an equilibrium can respond, and that's why we call it a dynamic equilibrium. Now, the French chemist Le Chatelier described how equilibrium responds to stress. So he came up with Le Chatelier's principle, which is if a system at equilibrium is stressed, the equilibrium will shift in the direction that relieves this stress. So an equilibrium wants to be in a situation of little stress. And so some common stresses include changes in, I'm going to write changes up here, changes in concentrations, and this can be in the concentrations of reactants or products, changes in pressure. Now, changes in pressure are only going to occur in reactions where gases are involved. And then also changes in temperature. So if any of these things change, then we consider this a stress. And so equilibrium here, the equilibrium is stress, so the equilibrium will shift in the direction that relieves this stress so that it's in a situation of little stress. One final note is that catalysts do not change the values of a system in equilibrium. It only changes how fast the system reaches equilibrium. So again, equilibrium is a constant state under a given set of conditions, but can change to a different state if the conditions happen to change.
Today we're going to go over 3 different forms of hypertension or high blood pressure. We'll begin with the first level, which is called essential hypertension. Essential hypertension is the most common form of hypertension. The cause of this type of hypertension is unknown. Most patients are also unaware that they have hypertension when they have this level, the essential form of hypertension. They don't even know that they're suffering from it. Usually it is only diagnosed in patients who have had 3 separate blood pressure readings of 140 over 90 or higher, and it's clear that those high ratings are not due to some other medical condition or disease. So normal reading, there's no other disease or medical reason. They have 3 separate occasions of a blood pressure reading of 140 over 90 or higher. They have essential hypertension. Most people are unaware of it until it has been diagnosed in this manner. Secondary hypertension is the next level. Secondary hypertension only affects about 5% of those who have hypertension. Once they've been diagnosed with it, it's usually due, the secondary form of hypertension is usually due to some other medical condition, such as renal disease, renal artery stenosis, aldosteronism, and pheochromocytoma. These are the sorts of things that would lead to secondary hypertension. Finally, the third level is malignant. Malignant hypertension is uncontrolled, severe hypertension and is life-threatening. It can be due to secondary causes, renal artery stenosis, or there may be no known cause, but the blood pressure levels are so high that they have to be brought down safely but rapidly. So the goal with malignant hypertension is to provide immediate treatment by decreasing the blood pressure over several hours. So no more than 25% of lowered blood pressure over a 1 to 2 hour period. This is usually done with medication, such things as nitroprussides, nitroglycerin, clonidine. Things like this are the most common medications used to treat malignant hypertension. So remember the three ones that we looked at today. Essential hypertension, this is the one that most people have. They don't even usually know that they have it, but on 3 separate occasions they have a blood pressure reading of 140 over 90 or higher that is not clearly due to another medical condition or disease. Finally, secondary hypertension, 5% of people have that, and it's usually due to another disease, renal artery stenosis, things like this. And then last is malignant hypertension, which is a life-threatening condition that needs to have immediate treatment by various medications where the blood pressure is brought down slowly, no more than 25% over a 1 to 2 hour period. If you'd like to know more about hypertension and related issues, please click on the link beneath this video. It'll take you to a website that'll have more information and an ebook that's available for immediate download. Today I just want to highlight some of the basics related to ligaments. So we're going to just go over what a ligament is, what it does, the functions it helps provide, just as an overview. So beginning with the fact that ligaments are dense bundles of parallel fibers that connect one bone to another. Ordinarily this would be in the joints. So where the bones come together in the joints, the ligaments would be part of the joint capsule. Although they are not always in the joint, they sometimes connect directly to the bones and other nearby bones as well. But ordinarily they are part of the joint. So dense bundles of parallel fibers that connect one bone to another. Now ligaments do not contract like muscles. They are not there to provide a movement or muscles. Their job is a passive strengthening and supporting of the joints. So ligaments are a passive way to strengthen and support joints. They do not contract nor provide the same sort of things that a muscle fiber would provide to the body. Ligaments also contain nerves, and these nerves are especially sensitive to position and speed of movement. Position and speed of movement, and we need this sort of feedback as we're moving around and doing various things. It's good to have that kind of neurological feedback, but along with that it also protects us, because if the joints are moved too rapidly or in inappropriate angles or ways, it introduces pain, and this pain actually is helpful in preventing us from doing things that would seriously damage our bodies. So the pain is there to say, hey, don't go that direction, don't move that fast, don't do this with this particular joint. So the nerves are there to help us in positive ways, but also negatively to prevent serious injury. And ligaments are fully capable of rupture if they are placed under violent stress. So that's just been a basic overview of ligaments, these dense bundles of parallel fibers in the joints connecting one bone to another. They don't contract like muscles. It is a passive strengthening and supporting role in the body. They do contain nerves that are sensitive position and speed of movement, both providing a positive feedback for us and also negative feedback in the form of pain to prevent us from truly harming ourselves. And if enough stress is placed on ligaments, they can indeed be ruptured. Ask most snow skiers back in the day before they got good boot releases there, and they can all talk about having a tumble, ripping the ligaments in their knee, and needing some form of surgery. So anyway, that's the overview on ligaments. If you'd like to learn more, you can click on the link that's underneath this video. It'll take you to that website, and while at that website, you should find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download. The brain is one of the most important parts of our nervous system, and today we're going to go over the various parts of the brain and talk about some of the ways they contribute and help in the areas over which that part of our brain control. And so we're going to begin then with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe controls our emotions, our judgments, and our motor aspects of our speech, and is also the primary motor cortex for voluntary muscle activation. After the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe, which receives sensory information from touch, proprioception, which has to do with our ability to tell where our arms and legs are, and our orientation in space. So even with your eyes closed, you know where your arms and legs are. You have a sense of your body. This is proprioception. The parietal lobe helps govern that. Also, our sensation of temperature and pain. That's the parietal lobe. Then the temporal lobe is responsible for our hearing, auditory information, and our language comprehension. The occipital lobe is our center for visual information, our sight. The cerebellum coordinates all of our muscle function. And then we have the brainstem, and within the brainstem we've got the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. The brainstem governs our breathing, our respiration, our hearts, our cardiac center, and all the nerve pathways to the brain come through the brain stem. And then finally, moving on then from that to the diencephalon, which is the thalamus, subthalamus, and hypothalamus. The thalamus helps integrate and relay sensory information from the face, feelings there, our retinas, our cochlea from our ears, our taste receptors, and interprets sensation of touch, pain, and temperature. So our thalamus is very important to not only our sense of what we feel in terms of pain, temperature, touch, but also our retinas, our eyes, our cochlea, and our ears, and our taste and our tongue. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system and the neuroendocrine system. It maintains our body homeostasis, helps regulate body temperature, helps regulate our appetites, governs our thirst and how we feel that, our sleeping cycle, and hormone secretions. So once again, the brain, very integral, necessary, core part of our nervous system, broken up into these various regions and what they control. If you'd like to find out more about the brain and its relation to our nervous system, I encourage you to go to the link that you'll find below this video. At that website, you'll find an ebook that is ready for immediate download. I want to talk for a minute about pneumothorax, and pneumothorax is some injection or forming of air in the chest cavity, in the pleura around the lungs, the space between the lungs and the chest wall. When air is introduced for various reasons into this area, it puts a lot of pressure or tension upon the lungs, not allowing them to expand to their full distance, and the person feels short of breath, lowers their blood pressure, has a hard time breathing, and it can be very painful. And there are various classifications or reasons for pneumothorax, where this air gets in and causes sometimes even partial or total collapse of a lung. And I have the classifications on the board behind me here. A primary pneumothorax happens primarily in tall, thin people, young, tall, thin males most commonly. And a bleb, or an air blister, of various sizes on the outside of the lung has formed, and when it ruptures, it introduces this air and of course causes pressure in that cavity, perhaps partially collapsing the lung. So we'll put the word bleb up here, and realizing that it happens in tall, thin, younger people, usually males. So that's primary pneumothorax. A secondary pneumothorax has to do with a chronic disease like COPD or cystic fibrosis, these sorts of things. And because of the disease, it causes the problem of the air to form around the outside of the lungs in the chest cavity, putting more and more pressure on the lungs and causing problems in that regard. Traumatic pneumothorax occurs when either through blunt force trauma, a knife wound, some other form of exterior air being forced into the chest cavity. Sometimes it's chest tubes, sometimes it's even from surgery, but when the air comes in from the outside, gets into that cavity, once again putting pressure on the lungs, keeping them from inflating fully, and that painful situation of not being able to get your breath, of not getting the oxygen you need, and usually becoming, because of a trauma, introduces it. So we'll talk maybe about blunt force trauma, knife wound, surgery, chest tube. And then finally, a tension pneumothorax. Tension pneumothorax comes around when there's a one-way valve, if you will, air coming in but not being allowed to go out, coming in to the pleural space, that area between the lungs and the chest wall. And because it can't escape, it continues to build and build and build, and is a medical emergency and needs to be dealt with right away because it can be fatal. So we have one-way valve of some sort formed. Air comes in. But cannot come out, continuing to build the tension in the chest cavity around the lungs, creating a life-threatening situation. So these are the various stages or classifications or forms of a pneumothorax, where they come from. And I hope that information has helped you. Primary happens in tall, thin, younger males generally. Secondary is because of a chronic disease. Traumatic is a wound of some sort. And then the tension coming from that air coming in from the outside, sometimes also from chest tubes, but it builds and builds and builds and must be released medically before it becomes life-threatening.
Sound is a pressure disturbance that moves through a medium in the form of mechanical waves. And these mechanical waves transfer energy from one particle to the next. So notice here that sound needs a medium to travel through. And so that can be something like air, water, or some other matter. But either way, sound has to have a medium to travel through. And then the reason it needs to travel through something is because it's transferring energy from one particle to the next. Now, another thing you need to know about sound is that sound is transferred through vibrations. Vibrations transfer energy to adjacent particles. Now, this may be a little bit contrary to what you thought about sound, because you may think that sound is the actual movement of particles over a great distance. But actually, the particles aren't moving. Instead, vibrations transfer energy from one particle to an adjacent particle. And that way, sound moves out through the waves into other areas. But actual matter is not moving with the sound. The sound is just moving from one particle to the next. And so sound is transferred through the movement of atomic particles. And so these can be atoms or molecules. Now, waves consist of two things. We have compressions and rarefactions. So a compression is when particles are forced together. And so the opposite of that is a rarefaction. So this is when particles move farther apart and their density decreases. So you have a compression with particles moving together and a rarefaction with those particles moving apart. So one compression and one rarefaction constitutes a sound wave. Now, waves of sound energy move outward in all directions from the source. So you have a source right here, a source of sound, and so you have waves moving out in all directions. So actually, if you were to look at what this would look like scientifically, you'd have all these waves coming off, but that takes a long time to draw. And so different sounds have different wavelengths. And then the last thing that you probably should know is that sound is a form of kinetic energy. Now, when I say it's a form of kinetic energy, that's as opposed to potential energy, which sound isn't going to be potential energy because it's not energy stored up. Sound is energy in motion, so we call it kinetic energy.
Today I wanted to go over some of the effects of starvation, short-term, prolonged, and then extended periods of starvation, and then the changes that you see physiologically. And we're going to begin by talking about some of the triggers to starvation, and then look at some of those results of short-term, prolonged, and extended periods. So beginning with the triggers of starvation, wounds and illness really lead to a stress response, and that produces a hypermetabolic state. So this obviously isn't the only cause of starvation, but the body responds to a wound or to an illness by creating stress. And in that stress response, a hypermetabolic state is brought about. The body enters a hypermetabolic state, which leads to an increase in the body's need for calories and protein, and yet at the same time, due to the wounds and illness, you get a decrease in the amount of intake of calories and proteins. So once again, the body responding to a wound or to an illness, this puts stress on the body. That stress response leads to a hypermetabolic state, meaning that the body sends out a signal saying we need to increase or uptake the caloric and the protein intake, and yet at the same time, due to the wounds and illness, the caloric and protein intake goes down. So the body says, I want more, less comes in. This produces at least some level of a state of starvation. Now, over the short run, if this is not corrected, the wound isn't cured, the illness isn't taken away, the protein and caloric intake isn't increased, over the short run of this state of starvation, what you get is an increase in the nitrogen in the urine, a rapid loss of muscle and weight, and a greater output of urine. So one of the short-term effects of short-term starvation is an strong increase in the nitrogen in the urine, a strong increase in the output of urine, and rapid muscle and weight loss. If it's not corrected and there is a prolonged period where once again the body is still under stress, it is in this hypermetabolic state wanting an increase in calories, an increase in protein, and that is not met, then what you start getting then is, after it's been going on for a while, is the weight loss and the muscle loss actually goes down. It doesn't happen quite as rapidly in this prolonged state, and you get metabolic acidosis. You get metabolic acidosis, even though the weight and muscle loss, or because of the weight and muscle loss, is not going down quite as rapidly. What you do get, though, is a sharp increase in the ammonia in the urine and a decrease in the nitrogen in the urine. As you noticed here, short-term starvation saw a sharp increase in the nitrogen in the urine. Here, the nitrogen in the urine goes down, but the ammonia in the urine goes up. And then finally, if the starvation is not dealt with and it goes into an extended period, beyond this prolonged period, it becomes premorbid, cachexia sets in, you get weight loss, the mid-arm muscle circumference decreases greatly here, there's a sharp increase in the creatinine height index and the urinary urea, and then a decrease in the serum albumin, transferrin, and lymphocytes. So you can see how things change the longer the starvation goes on. So just once again, just to recap, due to some sort of stress on the body, for example, a wound or an illness, the stress on the body, the response to that stress is to send the body into a hypermetabolic state where the body is calling for more protein, more calories. However, that need is not met. The intake goes down due to the illness or the wound. And over the short term, the nitrogen in the urine goes up, the output of urine increases, and there is rapid loss of muscle and weight. If it's not dealt with over a prolonged period, the muscle and weight loss decreases at this stage, but metabolic acidosis kicks in and the ammonia in the urine goes up while the nitrogen goes down. And then over the extended period, premorbidity sets in, cachexia, weight loss, mid-arm muscle circumference decrease, the creatinine height index goes up, as does the urinary urea, while the serum albumin, transferrin, and lymphocytes decrease. That's just a basic overview of starvation and its effects over 3 different time periods on the body, and what causes it, those sorts of things. If you'd like to learn more about this, study further, there's a link underneath this video. If you'll click on it, it'll take you to a website that has that information. And while you're at that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
The body contains 2 varieties of sweat glands, eccrine and apocrine. Eccrine sweat glands are ring ducts that run from the innermost layers of the skin to the body's surface. Also, eccrine sweat glands secrete sweat to cool the body. Apocrine sweat glands are larger than eccrine sweat glands. Now with apocrine sweat glands, these glands emerge from hair follicles, under the armpits, areolae of the nipples, and around the genitals. Now, apocrine secretes sweat with oils and pheromones. Now, quickly about pheromones. Pheromones are chemicals that are detected by animals using their olfactory or smell sense. But going back to apocrine sweat glands, they are odorless sweat until it is exposed to the bacteria of the skin.
We want to briefly today go over the wall of the human eye. The human eye has a wall that's made up of 3 layers, an outer layer, a middle layer, and an inner layer. They each have a different name and a different function. We're going to go over those briefly. So we'll begin with the outer layer of the eye wall called the sclera. The sclera is here in the outer wall of the eye, and it is for protection. The cornea, the front of the eye, is actually attached to the anterior portion of the sclera, both top and bottom. I've only drawn in a representation of the top. And the cornea's job is to refract light that enters from the outside in order to put it through the lens and eventually put it onto the retina to allow vision. So the outer part of this 3-tiered system of the wall of the eye is called the sclera, and it's primarily for protection and anchors and holds the cornea. The middle layer of the eye wall is called the choroid. The choroid's job is basically to keep the inside of the eye dark. You're trying to receive light from the outside for vision. You can't have light coming in from all sides. It's got to come through a very narrow and small area, and so basically you've got a protective layer, a layer that creates darkness, and then you've got an inner layer, and this inner layer is called the retina. The retina, receiving the light coming in through the cornea, is responsible for communicating color and to the optic nerve, and therefore giving us vision. So within the retina, you've got both rods and cones. The rod's job is to take low light, colorless environments and to help us see, and the cones are for our color vision. I happen to be red-green color deficient, so my cones are messed up, and I have a very difficult time distinguishing red from green. Christmas tends to be a very boring holiday for me with all these different shades of brown, essentially. So I get asked all the time, how do you see colors? It's hard to describe. I do see colors, but I'm deficient in being able to distinguish reds from greens. They are very similar to me. But anyway, this has just been a basic overview of the eye wall and its 3 divisions, the outer, middle, and inner, sclera, choroid, and retina. If you'd like to learn more about this or related things, underneath this video you'll find a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to that website that has that information, and while you're on that website you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.